Episode 0. Why am I doing this? Hello, and welcome to this special preview episode, what I think might be better termed as a prelude or forward, or as simplest of all, introduction. My name is William May, and this is my first foray into podcasting. My own background is as a writer. I have an MFA from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where I primarily studied poetry, though in the years since I graduated, I have written a range of work, including not only poetry, but also prose, both fiction and nonfiction. But the truth is that despite whatever skills I may possess in terms of writing, I've never done well getting my work accepted for publication. I've been on a journey to change that, and this podcast is an attempt to document not only those explorations, but also the various aspects of the creative process my team and I are engaging with along the way. This episode is a small experiment in that direction, and one I hope will introduce you not only to our approach, but also to the rest of the creative team working to bring this podcast into existence.
Hi, this is Denise Marsa, and I'm sitting here with William May, poet, writer, novelist, and we are working on a podcast together. I'm a producer of the podcast, and right now we are talking in New York City because he's visiting from Florida. Hi, William.
Hi.
And one of the things we're doing today is we are kind of looking back at what we've done so far for the podcast. We're sort of doing like a demo podcast. Just to get it started, to figure out what it's going to be. And what we're doing today is we're coming back because we sent it to a few people for some feedback, and we want to make sure it's clear like what this podcast is going to be about, what William's intentions are, and that's what I'm going to ask him right now, just to come back into it. So William, what is your overall vision for this podcast, the format, etc.?
Okay, so as a writer, one of the things I think a lot about is the way that form and content interact. And for me, one of my goals in creating this podcast is more about trying to create something that is personal and that is about my journey. And I'm someone who has a lot of background in terms of the academics and in terms of learning to write. I have a master's of the fine arts in creative writing. Not that that's necessarily meaningful in a larger sense, but it's where I come from. It's the experiences I have and what taught me and developed me as a writer. And those are really great experiences, and they did teach me a lot. But the thing is that as someone who's trying to make this journey, I know that there are areas that I don't understand. And a lot of that is more about the business side, more about the publishing world itself, and not so much the writing. I mean, I can sit down and write a poem right now if you wanted to give me a piece of paper. It might take me a few minutes to get my head there, but it wouldn't be very difficult for me. As I tell people, inspiration is for amateurs. But, the point is that, I've trained myself, and for me as a writer, that's where I'm at. And I'm having a lot of difficulty because there are a lot of aspects of the publishing world that seem to me to not make sense. And I think a lot of that has to do with my own neurology, my own relationship to social issues, and also to technology right now, because things are changing in many ways. Thus, our incorporation of a behind-the-scenes framing set in the context of Meggie and I editing the original interview. It is not perhaps typical for an initial presentation, but truly, we don't want this to be just another book publishing podcast.
ARGH! Not another podcast about book publishing. Welcome to William May's podcast.
I think there's a new recording. Denise took care of that. And so we're going to have that. And then I think we decided we're going to get rid of that Welcome to William May's podcast line. I just think that's, it'll be better.
We did. If I think you said it, you listened to it. It's they took it off. So right now, and also the recording sounds much better because Denise recorded in her studio, so the sound is much better.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm excited about all that. I think it's going to sound good.
ARGH, Not Another Podcast About Book Publishing, hosted by William May, in which the author finds himself embroiled in a podcast about book publishing.
One thing I have about the intro,
Right.
and it's not about the intro. Every single podcast that I have listened, there is a sound that goes before the intro starts. So before ARGH, this is like not another podcast about book publishing. There is like a small, let's say, a few notes, and like here I wanted to ask Denise.
Yeah, Denise.
Yeah.
Since she's got a musical background, she probably could put together a little,
so I
little
think
stinger.
her feedback would be like valuable here. And I think we should have just something very, very simple. It's kind of like it adds to the mood. It could be anything from a piano.
Yeah,
So
no,
like,
just a few notes. Just like 3 or 4 note tune.
Here it is, episode 1 with William May.
let's say few notes. We have the intro, like the few intro, and then I think what we should have next is this. Let's say a few sentences. I did add my comments in my notes, so it's something that I've just written down just to give an idea of so a podcast about book publishing and let's say
setting the scene, as it were.
Yeah,
I think I'm going to write something that we can use at the beginning, because I also think we need to introduce before we just go into the interview, like why Denise is interviewing me. And that I'm the host, and that it's because I think, the idea of having sort of an introduction to the podcast is sort of the whole idea of this 0 episode anyway, on top of it being an opportunity for us to play around and figure out what we're doing, So I think I'm going to write something. It'll probably be along the lines of like me talking about, how we got here, kind of thing about that. And as I said, maybe I'll talk to Denise about having a little bit of, we talked to her about her introducing herself a little bit in there as well. So we can make that work, I think. And I think it'll give us a chance to sort of like set it all up. For me, part of the goal is for this to have a sort of journey frame where it's about at the beginning, the end, and maybe some stuff in the middle even will give an opportunity to sort of create that structure.
Not Another Podcast About Book Publishing, hosted by William May, in which the author finds himself embroiled in a podcast about book publishing.
So, William, wondering, do you define yourself as a poet?
I mean, I think I define myself as a writer, I would say. I'm a poet. I suppose that poetry is certainly a part of my makeup, and I would say that I am a poet. But I don't know, when you say define yourself, that feels limiting sometimes. It's part of my identity, but I don't know that I would use the word define myself. This is where, as a writer, you get very particular about language. You know what I mean? So,
which I understand. And so, but I think when you say a definition or defining, there's many definitions. So in keeping with the word defining yourself, you have a tagline that says a neurodiverse language wizard. Can you explain what neurodiversity is? And also, where did you come up with that tagline?
Well, neurodiversity is a fairly new term. It's a fairly broad term. It includes a lot of people who have differences in brain function, let's say, or in how they process information. Right. It includes people who are what traditionally was called learning disabled, including people who are autistic, people like me who are dyslexic. It also includes people with other kinds of issues. It can include people who have like OCD. It's a broad term, is largely about trying to find a way to define this experience of having a sort of processing difference in your mind, I suppose, but without defining it as a disability. I do worry a little. There are a few words in there. I'm not sure if issues was the right word to use. Like, it gets complicated, because I think part of the point of talking about neurodiversity as a term is to try to take away some of the stigma and the negative connotations and denotations of disability and, certain other words. So I think that's something that I hope I sort of was able to capture some of that.
There's one more thing. I think we were not able to really talk about the neurodiverse language lizard, which it might be a really interesting topic for many people who are struggling with the same thing. What do you think about that?
And for me, part of that is because when you process language as someone neurodiverse, you have a different experience of it. I mean, at least that's my understanding of it. I don't have a clinical, perception of that, but I know enough about my own experience of language and talking to other people and writing and reading that I know I feel like I experience language in different ways and that I can get into at some point, maybe in other episodes of the podcast. And for me, I would define magic as using symbols to manipulate what is symbolized.
And do you think it's all because of the political positioning of that as well? Like everyone's so careful now with what they say, what terms they use.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, everything is political, at a certain level. I mean, so when we call it a political thing, I think that what you're getting at is sort of more the question of whether it's something that exists as a sort of culture war issue or something like that. I think that's what I would, but I don't know if that's what you mean.
Well, I was thinking is like, you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And so I think these days everybody has to say something. I actually was looking at the Stephen Gaynor School where you went to school, correct?
Right.
I was looking at
Yes. Yeah.
And they use the word differences. They don't use the word disabilities anymore on their website. So that's where I'm thinking, like, they don't want to insult people. They don't want to.
And I think that it's not just a matter of not insulting people. It's also a matter of trying to present a more accurate idea in some sense. Because one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of the people who have learning disabilities, if you compensate and teach them in a way that is effective for them, they are very, very successful. They're not disabled in the traditional sense. They have an inability to maybe process things in the way that another person might. But, that's kind of true of all of us to some extent or another. Each of us has our preferred learning styles, our preferred way of functioning. And, for someone who's neurodiverse or who has what, as you said, Stephen Gaynor's now called learning differences, and what I still think of very essentially is learning disabilities, because that's the term I grew up with.
Right.
Those things are only a disability in the context where they're not being compensated for. And what's interesting is that most of the time, the things that work for people who are, for example, someone who has dyslexia, there are language processing issues. And so a person who's learning to read, who's dyslexic, will often need to learn in a particular way. But the opposite isn't true. The methods that work for teaching students who are dyslexic work just as well for students who are not dyslexic.
Okay.
So
an example. Can you do?
So for example, they switched at some point in language acquisition and teaching of reading to using a whole language approach as opposed to a phonetic approach.
Okay.
So in a phonetic approach, you break the word down into letters and you teach the student how to sound out the letters. In a whole language approach, it's more you look at the whole word and you learn to recognize the word and you build I'm not an educational, I'm not an educator, so I don't necessarily know the specifics of how these things work because I've never been there. But I know that this change was enacted at one point. And a result of it is students who were dyslexic could not learn accurately with the whole language approach. They needed the breakdown,
break it down.
And they needed a certain structure. Other students could do well using the other process. The point I'm making is that, like, while the students who are dyslexic had a limitation in some ways, as long as you gave them the opportunity to function, as long as you created a system that included them,
an environment that
they could thrive overall. To use myself as an example, when I was in first grade, I could not learn to read. I had a huge amount of trouble. I was literally, the school that I was in, it was a public school, and they were like not equipped to handle learning disabilities. They were basically going to just, pass me and let me be the next year's problem. And once I was taken from that environment and put into a remedial situation where I had the help that I needed and I learned to read, I went from reading absolutely nothing to reading like adult novels within like 6 months.
Well, because you were so hungry.
Well, because the problem wasn't that I wasn't smart enough to read. The problem was that no one had shown me how to unlock the tool of language. I had a very good friend when I was in first grade, and I was at his house, and we're sitting there, and we're trying to do homework, and he's like consoling me because I can't do the homework. And he's like, "Don't worry about it, Will. You're just dumb."
Oh.
And he didn't mean it. He just was, and his mother was sitting there, and she was like, "Well, he can't read. What do you want?" And she's like, "He uses the biggest words I've ever heard a first grader use. He's not dumb.
Right.
He talks better than your father." You know what I mean? I do feel like we can probably cut some of that down.
So it all starts with like the question of Denise is asking about the political situation and
talking about the change in language.
Yeah, because it's a lot of things. I would say to take the essence of it, like what's the most important message here? Because we have from minute 2 to minute 8, like it's a lot of things. So maybe take the essence of it and cut it down a bit. That's what I would suggest.
I agree.
So let's move forward to the next section.
So that must have been really frustrating for you. Here you could speak, but you couldn't necessarily read. But can you give an example, like if you can remember, if you can't, that's cool. The word education. How are you able to understand the word education?
Well, I think that for me, the first step is I had to be able to recognize letters.
Got it.
And as a person who's dyslexic, one of my issues is to do with processing visual information. So it's very easy for me to get disoriented when I'm looking at something. So it took a long time for me to be able to say, okay, I know what letter that is, because it's very easy. Like an E and a 3 are the same things. A D and a B and a P all are the same exact shape.
Oh, wow. So it's the shape of things as well.
Right. So the D, the B, the P, right? They're all the same shape. They're just different orientations. So a D is a backwards B, and a P is an upside down
B.
So if you're dyslexic and you have difficulty with that kind of orientation, I still have difficulty remembering right and left. Imagine that I gave you a thing where there were like 30 different shapes, right? And each of those shapes represented something, and you were handed a line of those shapes. And you don't know what these shapes are, but you're just, so like for me, that's what letters were. They were just these random shapes. And some of them looked identical because they are identical. It's just they have to be turned in order to be, like each one has an identity based not just on its shape, but on its placement. And so as someone who's dyslexic, that placement issue becomes difficult.
I get it. But actually, I had no idea what it really meant until just now.
Well, so that's part of it. There's a lot of other issues that exist within dyslexia. It's not like it's just one thing,
sure.
but for me, that's a big part of it.
it's sort of what the eye see and then how the brain relates it.
It's very hard to sort of put it in terms because I don't have an experience of what it's like not to be dyslexic.
Right.
So, you're asking me like, what is your experience? And I'm like, well, you tell me yours first, because then I'll know. I'll have something to compare it to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. P is a P. That's interesting. I guess we don't realize sometimes how lucky we are with things that we don't have.
There are a few seconds where Denise is trying to get the word. She's like,
right.
Wait a minute, wait a second. So I think I'm going to cut that. So I'm going to let her just ask the question. She's asking about an example of your experience of the word education. So, and then you start talking about, processing visual information. Words have different identities. I really like that. Overall, I really like this part.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I think my only concerns are that I do think it's important that, to be clear that this is not the only thing that is dyslexia. You know what I mean? That there's other issues, but I think I try to say that.
You did.
And I never say, oh, well, this is what dyslexia is. It's a broad topic. I had an educational specialist who I worked with a number of years ago who used to say to me that there's really not one dyslexia. There's a variety of things that you could call the dyslexias. Yeah. So I don't want to pigeonhole it as something, in that way. This is William May saying goodbye. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends. If not, please share it with your enemies.
ARGH, Not Another Podcast About Book Publishing, is produced by Denise Marsa, Meggie Dimitrova, and William May. Please visit WilliamMayWrites.com for social media links, recited poems, and more.